Hello, everybody. Welcome to People Ops School, where I have the great honor of talking with the very people working to make work healthier, more human, and more creative. Joining me today, I have Andrew. Andrew is a People Ops generalist at doesnt, a fully remote, globally distributed team. This is Andrew and I's first time meeting in person, quotes in person. But I've always been really impressed by Andrew's example of servant leadership and bringing a calm, balanced, and meaningful approach to work. I really appreciate you joining me today, Andrew. I'm excited to chat People Ops.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, awesome. Let's dive right in. I think something I've been learning over the past few years is that people operations can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I'd love to hear what people ops means to you, Andrew.
Yeah. So that is the $1 million question.
Right?
Yeah. And as I've come to learn more about people ops, because when I joined doist, this term had never really
Right.
popped up in my circle before.
Yeah.
But for me, it's really come to signify kind of this shift in the way that organizations think about people,
Mm.
and the value that they have within the organization. So I think there's an older mindset, or like a more outdated mindset, that views employees as being replaceable, or kind
Mm.
of a means to an end within the company.
Mm.
Like you plug them in, you exhaust them, you use whatever you can, and
Mm.
then you move on and find the next person. Which obviously, at face value just sounds pretty terrible, but this, newer approach and new way of thinking about people and the value they bring is that they, within any company or organization, it's not the product or the service that's actually adding the value. It's the people who are making those
Mm.
products and services happen.
Yeah.
And I think that's really become a big realization as companies have, kind of as they've seen that innovation accelerating, and just the ability to keep up with that more difficult.
Mm.
Um, so, at the end of the day, it's the people who help you kind of stay relevant and stay up to date.
Yeah. I like that perspective. I think something that's unique about doist is I feel like your team has believed these things for a while now. And some organizations are maybe like starting to catch up and think about it a little bit more. But I think something you're explaining there is a term I hear a lot, especially in early stage venture backed companies, is this idea of like growth at all costs. We can burn out our employees, then hire new ones.
Yep.
And you and I, of course, know that that's not always like a long term sustainable approach.
Right.
So I like your framing of that.
Thanks.
You mentioned sort of people operations as a concept idea. Starting to learn about that as you started at doist. I'd love to hear, you've been in that role for about 3 years now. Is that right?
Yeah.
What did people operations at doist look like when you first started? And then what does it look like today?
So that's kind of a loaded question.
Yeah.
So yeah. So when I joined, there actually was no people ops team. Like, it was still like doist had previous kind of HR or people ops people doing different things,
Yeah.
but they still hadn't really thought about, what does this look like long term for us. So I was actually hired right out of grad school, and I had never been in a formal, HR or people ops role in my life, with the task of kind of corralling things together and starting to lay down that framework. And fortunately, like, I had a lot of help because, as you mentioned, doist already kind of has a lot of these values just ingrained in the culture. So, it wasn't like a huge uphill battle to get people to realize that people are important and should be valued,
Right.
which, makes a huge difference for someone in my role. but early on, it was definitely kind of this sense of, I can only describe it as flailing around trying to understand my role and what I should be doing and what we want to do as a company, and all while, keeping different things like hiring and, onboarding and all of these different processes, moving.
Right.
So it's this very difficult position where you have one hand in the day-to-day operations and the other hand in strategy, and you're trying to find the balance between the two. Fortunately, like, after about 2 years, we hired a second people ops person, and
Cool.
and now we're able to tag team on a lot of those things, and we've really been able to establish a really good foundation to build from. So.
Yeah, cool. I think something you mentioned in there kind of at the start was the idea of like buy-in from the team and from leadership. I think that's something that when I was getting started in people operations at Buffer, that was something that I, like, looking back, was really fortunate to have without necessarily knowing it.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to hear kind of what you, and I'm leading with that and maybe hinting at what I think the answer is, but I'd be curious to hear what you think it looks like for an organization to like really truly invest in people ops.
Yeah. So, of course, there are so many different ways to answer that, but I think the biggest thing that comes to mind for me and that I've seen is that, there's this sense of proactivity about adding value to the employees in your company. I think when you consider the fact that, on any given team, like, the people who are there have all consciously made the decision to join that company, to invest their talents and their time, on your mission, is not something to take lightly. So, I think any organization that realizes that and says, "Oh, okay, like, that's, we didn't like force anyone here; they all want to be here." So, I feel like that should naturally just create a sense of desire to proactively add value to those people, because ultimately it helps them be at their natural best, and that's a win for the individual and ultimately for the company.
Yeah. Maybe I'll ask kind of like the flip side of that question. What do you think it looks like when an organization is like not investing in people ops?
Yeah. I guess the most immediate reaction is, or I guess it is, reactivity to the needs of the team. It's always kind of an afterthought of, like, the priority is the product, and like the mission, and people are secondary to that. But, that eventually, that may work as a small team that's still kind of finding its footing.
Right.
But eventually you get to a point where either, your culture doesn't scale, people burn out, and you kind of develop this, I guess, cultural debt, I guess, for lack of a better word, where, there's, you just can't get out from underneath the weight of everything that's accumulated over time. So, and it's a lot more difficult to fix after the fact than to proactively kind of anticipate.
Yeah. I think this idea of debt when it comes to people ops is really interesting. Especially a lot of people are generally slightly more familiar with the idea of technical debt. And I feel like starting to use that term more and more is maybe a reflection of like where organizations as a whole are moving, starting to think more and more about people. I have kind of just like a specific question, but I think something that's interesting in your response there was the idea of investing in people ops earlier. And so you're not accumulating that debt. So I'm just kind of curious, and I get this question a lot from founders around like, when should I bring on my first people ops person? So I'd be curious to hear, you mentioned recently there's a second people ops team member. So what was doest's team size when you joined and started working on people ops? And then what was the team size when you brought on a second team member?
Yeah. So I think I was employee 58.
Cool.
So, it doesn't sound like a lot of people, but it was already like quite a big size for our team.
Yeah.
And then our second teammate joined at about, I want to say like a little 75-ish, something around that area. But even at the time that I joined, you could already kind of tell like it's kind of too, we should have done this sooner. So yeah, and I guess the best time to, in general, to add a people ops person is whenever you're ready to do it. The sooner the better, because again, it's kind of that laying the groundwork when you're a small team is way easier than when you're bigger and there's a lot of already like solidified processes and ways of doing things that can make it difficult to kind of take a step back and say, okay, well, we've been doing this for 10 years and now we're just gonna, we need to do this now, or we need to move away from that.
Yeah. I think something that from where I sit, Doist does really well, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but you mentioned like process and structure. And I see a lot from Doist around like documentation and asynchronous communication. And I think the content your team creates has been very helpful the last few months, since almost this whole year, as more and more teams figure out what it looks like to work remotely. And so I'd love to hear kind of your take, I guess, on like process and documentation. And some people will like tend to have a slight aversion to process and documentation for teams that are moving quickly and want to like be creative and flexible. And you've obviously been working in people ops on a remote team for quite some time. So it's like a pretty broad question, but just kind of your take on how important is documentation and process for a remote people ops department?
Yeah. It's important for sure, because I mean, I can say even now, like we're behind on some of our documentation, and we can feel the impact of that kind of backlog that we have building up. But I think in general, what I've most appreciated about the way Doist approaches a lot of documentation and process is that we're not very into establishing a ton of bureaucracy. It's about finding that sweet spot of this process will get things moving in the right direction and it's not burdensome. So you're able to get the work done without creating a ton of extra work that can come from a very bulky process. But on the flip side, we also for example, this year we've we finally finished off our the early stages of our development framework at Doist, which was a very long project that obviously like has a ton of moving parts and a lot of processes within processes, and it's an unfamiliar territory for a lot of people. So we're kind of working through that aspect as well of, okay, like for something like this, you can't really get away with like super light processes, otherwise it's easy up front, but then things start to break further down the line. So we're still learning where that where do you draw the line then for between too little process and too much process.
Yeah, that's a really great example. And it's tempting to always want to get it like perfect on the first try, but it'll evolve and you'll learn things. I think that when I was at Buffer, someone on the product team shared like a concept from product that I still think about a lot with people ops around when you launch a new feature, you can't just like celebrate the launch, you have to celebrate adoption. And so I think about that a lot with people ops. Like we can sit down and write down a process and document something. That part is kind of easy. The hard part is getting people to then like understand and buy in and start to adopt it. Does that like resonate, or how do you kind of work on that adoption piece at doest?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably like the biggest challenge that we face in people ops is
Yeah.
that, you kind of think back to like the academic side of things,
Mm,
and the theory is all great on paper and you're like, yep, this has to work.
yeah.
There's no way it won't. It's like airtight.
Mm,
But then once you implement, and you start to get actual people
right.
involved in whatever that is, then you start to see, where things are breaking down, and some people don't like it and other people love it,
Mhm.
and you have to start dealing with the real, real life and real circumstances, and I think that's where you kind of just have to start taking that feedback in
Mm,
and making those micro adjustments as they make sense.
yeah.
um, but I think it's very easy to get stuck in that place of, it has to be perfect first and then we launch, and unfortunately, if that's how you approach things, you'll never do
Yeah.
anything. It's always because we operate in such a gray area. It's
Hmm.
it's all, there is no perfect solution to anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I like how you brought it back to just like people and humans, and we're all different. I think
yeah.
good and smart starting place. Yeah, I have one last question. I'd love to hear what is something you wish you had known sooner about people ops? Maybe something that you've learned in the last 3 years at Doist, or something you've gotten clearer on in the last few months.
Mhm. Yeah, this one has actually been on my mind a lot.
Mm,
3 years in, it's been long enough to have had some experiences, and start to, have those perspectives. And I
mm,
think the biggest thing that I've learned so far is that you can't make everyone happy.
mm,
I'm kind of cheating because I already knew that going into this entire space.
yeah.
But, when you're outside looking in, it's very easy to say like, oh yeah, like you can't make everyone happy. But once you're in it and you care about the people, and,
Hmm.
you're kind of at the forefront of, you know, hearing how people feel about what you're doing, it's on top of, the gray area that you're constantly operating within.
Hmm.
It's very easy to kind of feel discouraged about what you're working on, and
Mm,
feel like you're not making good progress, and that people don't like you, or they don't like your
mm,
solutions. And and of course, like, those are normal feelings to have. And obviously there's like a certain extent of self-management that goes into that as well. But I think the biggest thing I've gained out of that is realizing that, as long as you're kind of communicating transparently, and
mhm,
kind of doing your part to show people where you want to take them, and what you're seeing from your perspective,
mm,
especially because a lot of times it's not the type of thing that the average person, like outside of the people ops space,
yeah.
like thinks about intuitively. Like, and they're often not thinking about, you know what do we want the team to look like in
Mhm,
a year from now, and
mhm,
how do we prepare for that.
mhm,
um, I think it helps reinforce that you're all there to help everyone be successful, um, and that there's some trust that goes into that, but it's also not like an absolute sort of thing where,
right.
we're making decisions, and that's that. It's like constant iteration,
Mhm.
and adapting to what's needed. So.
Yeah, I think you touched on something that's really like resonating with me that I didn't quite realize when I asked this question, but the idea that people ops work is often like a long haul that you don't have as
Mm,
necessarily as many like quick wins that feel good and
right.
you're checking things off. It often takes some time to see the impact of your work, whether it's something like
Mhm.
a development framework or diversity and inclusion work. It takes a long time for that work to
Yeah.
really be effective. So I said last question, but I have one more. I'm curious if you
For
have
it.
anything, and this is more for people who are also working in people ops. Is
Yeah.
there anything that like, is there a way you get those quick wins? I think there are certainly things outside of work. Like, I just put together a bed frame and I followed instructions and then I was done and I did it. But in terms of, I guess, like inside or outside of work, like where do you get those like quick wins? Because the day-to-day work of people ops is often kind of a long haul.
Yeah, yeah, and I've can admit that I've struggled with that at times. Like
Yeah.
if I if I lose control of just how I'm managing myself, it's very easy to lose sight of that. But
Mm-hmm.
um, the biggest thing that has made a difference for me is focusing on those little interactions. It's
Mm,
day to day, like someone asked you for help with something and you helped them, you helped clarify that, or you helped
right.
point them in the right direction. um, and of course, like in the day to day, you still hopefully get those little like you know uh, supportive comments and feedback from people around you. But I
Mm,
think knowing that you're working towards like a much bigger outcome, and that even if in the next month no one is going to see what I'm trying to do, and they're never going to accept or understand it,
mm-hmm.
you know in in multiple months or even in a year, like they're going to hopefully see things differently.